Welcome back for part B of this episode of the Edwardo Series. Today we'll continue giving biblical answers to Pastor Edwardo's list of consequences of keeping the law, after we hear what Pastor Edwardo has to say about it.
Also, it puts you under a curse. In Galatians 3 and verse 10, as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Then verses 13 and 14. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree, that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Why be cursed through reverting to Judaism when you can be blessed in the law of Christ?
Who said anything about Judaism? Observing God's law is not Judaism. Judaism is a man-made religion filled with the traditions and doctrines of man. Some traditions in Judaism even allow them to break God's commandments. Now, let's read those verses from Galatians again. Galatians 3:10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Paul is quoting and agreeing with Deuteronomy 27:26, telling us that if we continue not in all things written in the law, because, for example, we think it's done away and abolished, then we're cursed. In Galatians 3:13, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law. The curse of the law comes when you break the law. Deuteronomy 11:26-28. Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. A blessing if ye obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if ye will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day. Keeping the law doesn't put you under a curse. Breaking the law puts you under a curse, and Christ redeemed us from the curse that came when we broke the law.
Also, it reduces one to servant status. Galatians 4:1-7 shows the difference between a son and a servant. He said in verse 6, Ye are sons. Thou art no more a servant, but a son. And a reading of that in the context shows that when you go back and keep the law, you reduce yourself to a servant. Why be a servant when you can be a son and have all the advantages and the benefits of sonship?
So if you keep God's law, you're a servant, but if you reject, do away with, and transgress God's law given through Moses, then you're a son? This is not at all what Paul is saying here, and this goes against our Savior's example that he's given us to follow. In past episodes, we've dealt with the surrounding context of this section of Galatians with the seed, the schoolmaster, Paul's allegory of Sarah and Hagar. If we keep all these in mind as we read about the difference between the servant and the son, it may help us in interpreting what Paul is saying here. Starting in Galatians 3:29, And if ye be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Here Paul is talking about those of us who are Christ's, who are Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. Before faith came, we were under the law of sin and death, in bondage under the elements of the world, until the time appointed of the Father. After we've been in bondage under the elements of the world, the schoolmaster of the law of sin brings us to Christ and we come to faith, receiving a heart of flesh, when God sends forth the Spirit of His Son into our hearts in which He writes His law. Then we're no more servants, but sons.
But also, it puts you in bondage. In the book of Acts, in chapter 15, when this was being discussed in Jerusalem among the apostles and elders, in verse 10, it is said, Why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? When you go back and keep the law, you know what you're doing? You're putting a yoke about your neck. In Galatians 5:1, it is written, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage."
Nowhere in the Bible is the law of God given through Moses ever referred to as bondage. What Peter is referring to as bondage in Acts 15 is the traditions and doctrines and commandments of men, specifically certain men in Acts 15:1, who taught that you must be circumcised to be saved. This is just simply not true, either in the New Testament or the Old Testament. Nowhere does God ever say that you're saved by being circumcised. Sheer obedience to the law does not bring salvation. It's bondage to try to keep the law by the flesh in order to gain salvation, because that's not what the law is for. The law shows you the way to live after you're saved through faith. Then the law brings liberty. Psalm 119:44-45. So shall I keep thy law continually forever and ever, and I will walk at liberty, for I seek thy precepts. When Paul writes in Galatians 5:1 to be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage, there are three things that Paul refers to as bondage in the book of Galatians. Bondage under the elements of the world, bondage of serving false gods, and bondage of keeping the law only by the effort of the flesh in order to gain salvation, which would really be bondage under the traditions and doctrines of man. This is what Peter is referring to as bondage in Acts 15, but nowhere is the law itself ever referred to as bondage.
Then from verse 2 of Galatians 5, another consequence is it makes Christ unprofitable. "Behold, I, Paul, say unto you." What do you have to say about this, Paul? "That if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing." You know how much Christ profits? Nothing. If you go back and keep the law of Moses.
Actually, it says, "If ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing." Not, "If you keep the law like God says to, Christ shall profit you nothing." What's the difference? Isn't circumcision part of the law? Well, when Paul speaks of circumcision, he could be speaking of 4 different things. Circumcision of the flesh, which is commanded by God in the law. Circumcision of the heart, which also was commanded in the law. The circumcision as a Jewish religious group who believed that you had to be circumcised to be saved. Or circumcision as a reference to Jews in general. Out of these 4 ways that Paul uses the term circumcision, number 3 makes the most sense with Galatians 5:2. So now that we know how Paul uses the term circumcision, we can see that what he's saying is that if you're trying to gain salvation by joining a certain group or by your own works, then Christ shall profit you nothing. He can't be saying that keeping the law like God commands us to makes Christ unprofitable, because even Christ himself told us to keep the law. But there's something else Paul tells us about the circumcision in Galatians 6:12-13 that's very important. "As many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. For neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh." So now we know that being circumcised doesn't equal keeping the law, because Paul tells us that they who are of the circumcision don't even keep the law.
Also, it obligates you to do the whole law. Verse 3, he said, "I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law." So if you go back and keep part of it, you're obligated to keep all of it.
We're already obligated to keep all of the law, because God already commanded us to keep all of it. Look at Deuteronomy 6:24-25. "And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is at this day. And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord our God as he hath commanded us." And Deuteronomy 8:1, "All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers." So this isn't really a consequence of keeping the law, because God already commanded us to keep all of it. But what is Paul talking about in this verse? "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law." Remember we just read in Galatians 6 that those of the circumcision don't keep the law? Jesus said to the religious leaders in John 7:19, "Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keepeth the law?" Stephen said before the council and the scribes and the high priest in Acts 7:51-53, "Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, ye do always resist the Holy Ghost." As your fathers did, so do ye. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them which showed before the coming of the Just One, of whom ye have been now the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the disposition of angels, and have not kept it. So now we know that they who are of the circumcision don't keep the law, but instead keep their own traditions and doctrines of man. And we've seen Paul, Jesus, and Stephen all telling them to keep the law, just like we should be keeping all of the law because God commanded us to.
Further, in Galatians 5 and 4, it makes Christ of no effect. Because, Paul said, Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law. So if you try to be justified by the law, it makes Christ ineffective.
That is correct. If you are trying to be justified by your own effort of keeping the law, rather than by faith, then Christ has become of no effect unto you. But this in no way proves that we shouldn't keep the law. It's just that we're not justified by our own fleshly efforts of keeping the law, but by faith.
Also, it causes one to fall from grace. Look at the last part of verse 4. He said, you're falling from grace. You don't want to do that, do you? Because you're saved by grace. Ephesians 2 and verse 8.
Galatians 5:4. Christ has become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the law. Ye are fallen from grace. Those who are trying to be justified by their own efforts of keeping the law are fallen from grace. Not because grace and law are opposites, which they're not, but they've fallen from grace because they're trying to be saved by their own works, by the effort of the flesh, apart from grace and faith. We have just a couple more of Pastor Edwardo's consequences to go over, but we'll have to deal with those next time. As you've seen so far, none of these supposed consequences really prove that we're no longer to keep God's law. And since we can't find any proof against it, then we should, as God commands us to, keep the law of Moses.
Also, it puts you under a curse. When you go back and keep the law, you reduce yourself to a servant. When you go back and keep the law, you know what you're doing? You're putting a yoke about your neck. You know how much Christ profits? Nothing. If you go back and keep the law of Moses. Also, it causes one to fall from grace.
Hi everyone. If you have a reason or a verse for why we should not keep the law of God given through Moses, leave it in the comments section below, and I'll try to answer it biblically in a bonus 16th episode at the end of this series. Thanks for watching!